Welcome back everybody. Today I want to talk to you about how I use my Fujifilm X-T4 for landscape photography, and I want to give you a couple of tips that I use when capturing seascapes, landscapes and also woodland photography. So usually Fujifilm cameras aren't really seen as landscape photography cameras, but rather travel and street photography cameras just because of their smaller and compact size, because they're APS-C cameras, and also due to the cropped sensor. People just dismiss them as landscape photography cameras in general because of their supposed inferior image quality and dynamic range. So if you want to enter into landscape photography with a Fujifilm camera, I can let you know you can rest easy. Fujifilm cameras are just as capable as full-frame cameras, just I guess in different categories. Today I want to talk to you about 5 different topics that I came up with that I thought they might be a bit random, but I thought they were quite important if you're trying to enter the field of landscape photography, and you should just keep them in mind when trying out and getting into it. First of all, let's talk HDR. So high dynamic range is a very important aspect of using an APS-C camera for landscape photography, because you're oftentimes working with scenes with high contrast, for example at sunset, where you have a very bright sky and very, I guess, dark scene, dark foreground, whatever. And in all of these cases you want to use the HDR mode or the bracketing mode on your camera, because this way you'll just get more dynamic range to work with. And yeah, as I said, there's the HDR and the bracketing mode, and I will now go into what I use for what scenario. So the HDR mode is quite simple. Your camera just takes 3 shots, one that's properly exposed, one that's one stop overexposed, and the other one is one stop underexposed. And your camera just merges them together, so you only have one file on your camera with high dynamic range. The bracketing mode is a bit more complex than that, which is you can set your camera up to shoot in between 3, 5, 7 and 9 shots, and then you can basically move the stops you're using in increments of 1/3 to 3 stops. So you can use one properly exposed, then like 1/3 of a stop over, then the other one 1/3 of a stop over, and so on and so forth. So just as an example, I usually use the 5 shots on the bracketing mode. So I have one shot that's properly exposed, and then I'll have 2 shots that are each, well, one is 1 stop overexposed, the other one is 2 stops overexposed, and the other way around as well, with 2 shots underexposed. And then I'll have 5 files because it doesn't merge them together. So I will have to do that manually in Lightroom. Using bracketing mode, I find that I have more data to recover from the highlights and also the shadows, because you just have more data in general. And I will always use the bracketing mode except in one situation, and that situation is if I have to, or if I'm shooting a panorama and I have to stitch the images together after in Lightroom. In this situation I will use the HDR mode because it's just easier to stitch 4 images together instead of having 20 images that you first have to exposure merge and then also stitch together. Yeah, so in this situation I will use the HDR mode. In any other situation I will use the bracketing mode. Secondly, let's talk film simulations and different formats. So Fujifilm is broadly loved for its film simulations or its color science, which is a direct result of the film simulations that are being offered on the camera. So if you've watched my last video, you will know that I love using the film simulations, but especially in landscape photography, I don't use them as well, because I don't use the JPEG file, I use the RAW file. So I will still use the film simulations, but I just use them as a guideline to where I want to go with my pictures. So it's good practice to just switch between all the film simulations that are being offered by the camera and also the film recipes that you can create yourself on the camera. It portrays the pictures you want to take in a completely different light. For example, if you're shooting black and white in comparison to if you're looking at the shot in like the highly vibrant mode Velvia, you have a completely different result. Especially on days where the weather just isn't on your side. For example, if you have fully gray or fully blue skies and there's just no detail in the sky, I find it a very good practice. It helps me quite a lot to just set my camera up to black and white, and this way when I'm trying to shoot all the compositions I can come up with, I can look at them in a completely different light and actually like quite a lot of shots like this. Lastly on this topic, let's talk about the different formats the Fujifilm X-T4 offers. So the standard format is 3x2, which is literally just the sensor size, and then you can also switch your camera to either 16:9 or 1:1. which is square mode. So of course 60:9 is usually used for video shooting, and personally I don't think it lends itself particularly well for photography. Personally I just don't like it, maybe other people like it and they're free to do so, but I love switching from the 3:2 format to the actual 1:1 format, the square format. I love using that, just gives me a lot of inspiration and gives me like a different outlook on different compositions that I'm trying to shoot. And if you're shooting in RAW plus JPEG mode, which I also made a topic in my last video, you're actually shooting the JPEG file, which you'll get the 1:1 file, but the RAW file will actually be the full sensor size, so 3:2. And if you need to edit something either to the left or the right side of your square file, you have the ability to do so afterwards in your RAW file. So thirdly, I want to talk about high ISO, and this is not something that's specific to Fujifilm, but rather APS-C cameras in general. People usually refrain from using APS-C cameras or using high ISO on APS-C cameras because they generally just handle it worse than full-frame cameras. So if you're shooting a composition that contains a lot of moving grass or moving leaves on trees, you want to make sure that you adjust your shutter speed accordingly to freeze everything in the moment, even if that means you have to use a little higher ISO. Fujifilm cameras, for example, or the Fujifilm X-T4 at least, it starts at 160 ISO, which is already a bit worse than a lot of full-frame cameras, which I think start about 80 to 120 ISO. But you shouldn't worry using ISO that's a bit higher than usual, even if you go to like 1600 or 3200 ISO, because it's more important to actually freeze the scene fully instead of having very low ISO. So if you're actually shooting a tree with a lot of moving leaves on there because it's a windy day, and you use your base ISO, 160 on the Fujifilm X-T4, and you just adjust your shutter speed according to the exposure, so you have a perfectly exposed shot, you might end up with an image that's very clean ISO and grain-wise, but all the leaves are blurry, and if that's not exactly what you're going for, then it's just not very pleasing to look at. Basically, you're just better off increasing your ISO to maybe 400 or 800, or even if you have to go a bit higher, 1600 or 3200. It's better to do that and have your shutter speed on maybe 125th or 250th of a second and actually have a crisp, clean shot. And yeah, the ISO will be a bit higher, the grain will be a bit worse, but it's honestly a shot that will look way better in comparison to a shot with fully blurry leaves. So my fourth point is actually something that's better and worse with Fujifilm or APS-C cameras in general in comparison to full-frame cameras. So we have actually got an edge on the full-frame people in regards to aperture, because in portrait photography you want a shallow depth of field, which you will receive with a full-frame camera and low apertures. But in landscape photography you usually want your entire composition to be in focus, usually. And this way we actually got an edge on full-frame cameras because we can just use like f5.6 or f8 and already have like almost the entire scene in focus, whereas full-frame cameras have to be on f9 or f11 to have everything in focus. And this of course means that we can use lower ISO and also higher shutter speeds to shoot our scenes. Conversely, full-frame cameras of course can handle high ISO way better than APS-C cameras, and therefore they can just increase their ISO to make up for the higher aperture figure they have to use. Though this basically just shows that APS-C cameras and also of course Fujifilm cameras therefore can handle landscape photography just as well, maybe in different points, as full-frame cameras. And yeah, this is just a point of contention for a lot of people that are thinking of either switching to Fujifilm or APS-C cameras or starting out with them. Last but not least, and this is one of the best and I think for a lot of people most important reasons when switching or starting out with Fujifilm, is especially on the X-T line, the handling of the cameras and also the lenses is just like no other. Because you get to change your ISO, your shutter speed and also your aperture with physical dials on your camera and on your lens, and this gives you a way better understanding of what a certain composition needs when you just look at it, because you have these figures right in front of you all the time. So I hope all these points give you a better understanding of why people are using Fujifilm cameras, the X-T line, and especially the X-T4 camera for things like landscape photography. And maybe you can actually use a couple of points that I made right here for your photography yourself. For example, using black and white when you're somewhat in a creative rut, the weather just isn't on your side, and you just want to try something else. Anyway, let me know in the comments down below, what do you think of the points I made here? Do you agree with them? Do you disagree? Just, yeah, I'd be curious to know. If you like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you give me a thumbs up. It boosts the YouTube algorithm immensely, and it just helps me out spread the video to more and more people. If you want to see more videos like this, I'd appreciate it if you'd give me a subscribe. And yeah, that's it from me for today. Have a good one. Bye.